Hello everyone, welcome to lesson 6 of our AP language prep course. This is the final lesson in this series of video lessons, and we are going to be talking about the writing questions and writing passages in the multiple choice section today. So as we talked about last time, the multiple choice section has 5 passages. 2 of them are reading passages that have reading questions that go along with them. And those will be more content-based. They talk about, what's said in the passage, how the author conveys certain ideas in the passage, things like that. And then the other 3 passages are writing passages with writing questions. These are incomplete drafts, and the questions ask you how the writing can be improved. How can we make changes to make the writing stronger? Those are the question types we're going to talk about. There are a couple of different types of writing questions, and we'll get into specifics and what the method is for solving and approaching each of those specific types. So we talked about last time how for reading passages, we want to use an active reading strategy to get a full, complete understanding of the passage before we look at the questions. Our approach to writing passages is different. I was going to say a little bit different, but it's actually very different. We don't need a complete understanding of what's going on in the passage. And that's because the questions aren't asking you what's going on in the passage. The questions are going to be about how the passage is written and things like that, right? It's not asking you to memorize the content or to understand what the author is actually talking about. Additionally, they will also tell you which parts of the passage each question requires you to look at. So we don't need a map, right? We created a map with our active reading last time to help us find evidence. We don't need that because the question, every single time, the question is going to tell us where to look and which part of the passage we're talking about. So for both of those reasons, instead of active reading, we recommend skimming to get a basic understanding of the main idea of the passage. So instead of doing that active reading strategy that we talked about last time, where you kind of try to find the main idea of each paragraph, think about how the paragraphs relate to each other, etc., instead we kind of want to read the passage quickly and efficiently, try to understand the general idea of what's going on, but not really spend a whole lot of time with it, and don't worry if we miss out on some of the details. So here's our skimming strategy. Like I just mentioned, the goal is to read the entire passage quickly and efficiently, right? We don't want to take a lot of time. We want to spend our time on the questions themselves rather than spending much time on the passage, at least for the initial read-through of the passage. When we're answering questions, right, it's perfectly fine to spend time reading the passage to understand that part of the passage that we need to answer the question, but the initial read-through should be quick. You want to understand or try to understand what's going on, but if there's a word or even an entire sentence that confuses you or that you don't fully understand, don't go back and reread it. Don't spend time trying to figure it out. Just kind of skip over it. You just want to get a gist of the main idea, and you want to get a gist of the author's purpose, right? Essentially, what is this passage talking about, and why is the author writing this passage? That's what you just want to get the general idea about. It shouldn't take more than 60 seconds. If you're spending more than a minute on the initial read through of the passage, you're spending too much time. You are probably reading too deep into it. You are trying to get too thorough of an understanding. Quick, 60 seconds, and you should have an understanding of the author's purpose and message. This is the goal. These are the only 2 things we really care about for the initial read-through. It's not a very robust step-by-step method. Essentially, read fast, only pay attention to the big parts, skip over the details. If something confuses you, something you don't understand it, skip over it. So let's try it. Here is a writing passage. If you remember last time I talked about how it would tell you that it's a draft. The passage below is a draft, right? It tells us it's a draft. That's our cue that we're on a writing passage. So give this a shot. Pause the video and time yourself. Set a timer on your phone or on your computer or however you want to. Set a timer for 60 seconds. See if you can get through this whole passage, skim through it in 60 seconds, and walk away with the purpose and message of the passage. When you're done, come on back. Okay, so I actually haven't had a chance to read this yet, so I'm going to try this live in front of you. So 50 years since her death, her hard work and fabulous novels saw much modern audience. She bravely overcame challenges. Okay, so we're talking about an author, and she has famous novels. It talks about her personal experience, growing up in Florida, and it gave her freedom, that independence not available to everyone in the South. Okay, she's presumably an African-American author. This is all kind of about her background and her influences. It talks about the Harlem Renaissance a little bit, and people like her, and she's applauded as one of the best writers of her era. Okay, so done. I don't know how much time that was. I didn't time myself, but I'm assuming it was less than 60 seconds. It definitely felt like it was. And I have a general idea of what's going on here, right? We're talking about an author, Hurston. We're talking about how her experience growing up kind of influences her work. We're talking about how she kind of became famous with the Harlem Renaissance movement, and how, people like her writing. And the author's purpose here, right, is to either inform people about this author, or to praise this author, something like that. So that's it. That's all you have to do for the initial read-through. Most of your time, like 99% of your time on these passages, are going to be spent figuring out each question. And as I mentioned earlier, writing questions will always tell you which part of the passage you should be primarily concerned with. They will also indicate if you need to pay attention to any other parts of the passage, either directly stating it or implying it. So, for example, if it says, change sentence 4 to better transition into the following paragraph, well, it tells you directly that you need to pay attention to sentence 4, right? It tells you that sentence 4 is the primary part of this question, but it also tells you that you're transitioning into the following paragraph, right? So even though sentence 4 is the part that you're primarily concerned with, you also need to pay attention to the following paragraph as well in order to figure out how to make that transition. So any parts of the passage that are mentioned by the question, those are the parts you want to go back and read in depth. After you read them in depth, the steps vary based on question type, but you should have some sort of either concrete evidence or reasoning from the passage that leads you to a particular answer choice, right? It shouldn't just be, this one seems right. It should be, okay, this is the correct answer because this thing in the passage indicates to me that it's the correct answer. Here are the question types we are going to talk about. You have expression of ideas, supporting ideas, adding phrases, dividing paragraphs, adding or deleting sentences, and multiple effects. So we'll start with expression of idea questions here. And your job with this question type is to choose the answer choice that most clearly and effectively expresses a certain idea. These questions may explicitly tell you which idea to express, right? They might say, the author wants to express the idea that cats are furry, which is the best way for them to do that. Or these questions may ask you to express the main idea of a sentence. So it might say, or the main idea of a paragraph or the main idea of a passage, right? It might say the author wants to state the main idea of this paragraph, which is the most clear and effective way to do that. Or any other idea from the passage. That's kind of what they all have in common, though. They're going to ask you to pick the answer choice that most clearly and effectively expresses whatever idea it is that they're asking you to express. And to identify these questions, they will always ask you about either which one does it the best or which one does it most clearly and effectively. It'll say it expresses as an idea, it states an idea, it establishes an idea. It'll use one of those words or something similar. To answer these questions, first, if it doesn't tell us what idea we're expressing, we need to identify what idea we're being asked to express by returning to that area of the passage. So for example, if it asks us to express the main idea of a paragraph, we need to first figure out what the main idea of that paragraph is before we can figure out the best way to express it. So we need to return to the passage and figure it out. Once we know what idea we're expressing, we want to check each of the answer choices and find one that fits with that idea. So if it matches the idea, we'll hold on to it. If it doesn't match the idea, cross it out. A lot of the time, there will be answer choices that sort of match with the idea, which is why it's really important to pay attention to every little detail. We want to make sure that every single part of the answer choice that we think is the correct answer choice completely matches with every single part of the idea that we're expressing. We talked about like partially right answer choices last time. Same idea applies with the writing questions. There will be answer choices that seem close. There will be answer choices that have some correct components to them. You need to choose the one where the entire answer choice is correct. Partially correct is not correct. If it has any part of it that is not a match, that does not make sense, it is wrong. And finally, some expression of idea questions, all of the answer choices express the same idea, they just do it a little bit differently, and that's where like the most clearly and effectively kind of comes in. In the case where you have multiple answer choices or all of the answer choices express the same idea, you want to choose essentially the answer choice that is the most clear, concise, and straightforward. You don't want an answer choice that kind of walks around the idea. You don't want an answer choice that adds a whole bunch of unnecessary filler language or filler words. Straightforward, direct, clear, to the point, that's what you're looking for. So let's do some practice. So we have a passage here. Let me see if I can... Okay, that'll fit it all. We have a passage here, and we have a question. Now, since we're only answering one question, I am not going to have you guys skim this. Similar to how I didn't have you do the act of reading every single time in the previous lesson, it's just not time effective. We will only be doing maybe like 2 questions per passage. There's like 5 or 6 different passages I pulled from in this lesson, so it's not an effective use of time to skim every one when we're really only doing 1 or 2 questions. It's a lot more valuable to skim when you're answering more questions. However, if you think it'll help you answer the question, or if you feel more comfortable doing it, or if you just think you need practice, right? What you do when you pause is up to you. If you want to get into the habit of practicing that, absolutely go for it. I think it would be a smart idea even. I'm just not going to do the skimming when I review the question. But actually, yeah, now that I think about it, go ahead and do the skimming for each of these. At least the first time you see a passage, go ahead and skim it and try to identify the main idea and the author's purpose. And then try the question. So go ahead, give this a pause, skim that passage, try to figure out the answer to this question, and then we will go over it. Okay. So it says, in sentence 2, reproduced below, the writer wants to clearly and effectively, there's that word phrasing we were talking about, express, there's another keyword that tells us that it's an expressing ideas question, the ownership relationship between humans and cats. So that's really important. It tells us what idea the author is trying to express. The author wants to clearly and effectively express the ownership relationship between humans and cats. So we don't need to identify the idea here. It's given to us. This is the idea. This is probably the most important part of the question here. And then it reproduces sentence 2 for us. Sentence 2 says, however, cats have developed an intricate language, not for each other, but for the human beings who have adopted them as pets, which is underlined. Which of the following versions of the sentence best achieves this purpose? Okay, so A is as it is now. So that would say cats have developed an intricate language, not for each other, but for human beings who have adopted them as pets. So does this convey the ownership relationship between humans and cats? Well, sorry, my mom is calling me. I'm going to mute my phone really quickly. Okay. Does it convey the ownership relationship between humans and cats? That's what we're focusing on, right? And I think it sort of does, because it's saying that the human beings have adopted the cats as pets. So if they've adopted them as pets, right, that shows ownership. Adopt on its own doesn't show ownership, but as pets definitely does, right? It's saying that the humans own the cats. The cats belong to the humans. So yeah, I think A could work here. B says, however, cats have developed an intricate language not for each other, but for the human beings who enjoy having cats in their lives. Well, the sentence still makes sense, right? And yeah, it makes sense that cat owners enjoy having cats in their lives, but it doesn't as clearly express the ownership relationship, right? Adopted them as pets much more clearly shows that the cats belong to the humans than B does, right? Enjoy having cats in their lives. Well, you can enjoy having all sorts of things in your lives that you don't own, right? I can enjoy having my brother in my life, but I don't own him. So B or A is better than B, right? B does not clearly express the ownership relationship where A does. C, the human beings who often have dogs and other pets as well. Well, this doesn't even focus on the cats, right? So it's missing that part, and it's also missing the ownership part too. In fact, it shows ownership of other pets, but it doesn't show the ownership of cats necessarily, right? So I think A is better than C as well. D, the human beings who are naturally inclined to prefer cats to the company of dogs kind of has the same issue as B. Not only does it include extra information that we don't want to express about preferring cats to dogs, it also does not show the ownership, right? It just says that they prefer cats, which does not necessarily mean that they own cats. So not D. And E, the human beings who try to decode their language, that again does not show ownership. A is the correct answer here because it is the one that does what the question asks, right? It expresses the ownership relationship. So hopefully, even if you didn't get that right away, right? Because it is kind of hard to differentiate between these answer choices unless you are kind of specifically looking at this one detail. But hopefully now that I've gone through this, if you didn't pick up on that at first, now you understand what this question type is really asking you to do and how kind of nitpicky you have to be to differentiate here. Let's try another one. This one is a little bit different, but it's the same question type, and I believe it's the same passage as well. Yeah, it's the same passage. Give this one a try. You don't have to skim. You've already skimmed this passage, and then unpause when you're done. Okay. In sentence 18, reproduced below, which of the following versions of the underlined text best establishes the writer's position on the main argument of the passage? Okay. Establishes was another one of our keywords, right? Best was another one that we talked about in identifying this question type. What was it? Yeah, best establishes. So here is the sentence. And we want to establish the writer's position on the main argument of the passage. So we might need to first identify that before we can answer it, right? After all, a cat isn't meowing just for the sake of making noise. However, cats are less communicative than many other animals. So this is an example of a question where we need to look in multiple places, right? I mentioned earlier how the questions will tell you, where is it, up here? It'll tell you which part you're primarily concerned with, and then it'll also tell you about any other parts of the passage you need to pay attention to. Well, this one asks us about sentence 18, that's what we're primarily concerned with, but we want to establish the writer's position on the main argument of the passage. If we want the main argument of the passage, we kind of need to pay attention to the whole passage, right? Now, if we've done our skimming effectively, we should kind of already know what the main argument of the passage is. You guys have done that. I have not done that yet. So since it is completely necessary to answer this question, I'm going to go ahead, take a look at this passage, and try to identify what the main argument is. Many people believe that language is the domain of human beings. However, cats have developed an intricate language not for each other, but for human beings who have adopted them as pets. When communicating with each other, cats' talk is a complex signal. In particular, their tails provide cats' chief means of expression. So this is all talking about how cats communicate with each other. They use a range of vocal expressions. Since cats' vocal expressions are not used to communicate with other cats, it is logical to conclude that they developed this language expressly to communicate with their human owners. Okay. This fact is demonstrated more clearly when observing households that have only one cat. An only cat is very vocal. With others are more quiet. They only need to go to fellow cats to communicate in the natural way. Pseudo-purpose owners should take time to learn what their different meows mean. Okay. So just from skimming, I have a pretty solid idea that the kind of main argument of the passage here is that cats only communicate verbally in order to communicate with humans, right? They've developed the ability to communicate verbally to talk to their owners. When they're talking to other cats, they communicate non-verbally. That's kind of the idea I've gathered here, the main idea. So, which of these best establishes the writer's position on the main argument of the passage? Their position, right, that is their position. Their position is that cats speak for the sake of communicating with humans. So this says, after all, a cat isn't meowing just for the sake of making noise. However, cats are less communicative, I can never say that word, than many other animals. Well, I don't think that's expressing the best establishing the writer's position on the main argument of the passage, right? Because the main argument isn't about cats being less communicative than other animals. It's about the reasons why cats communicate in different ways. So, A, I don't think is correct. B, after all, a cat isn't meowing just for the sake of making noise. Rather, there's a good chance that that cat is trying to communicate with a nearby human friend. Yeah, that could work. Because meowing is verbal, right? It's using their mouth. And the passage talks about how they communicate verbally when they talk to humans. And that's what B says. So I think B could be correct here. C, after all, a cat isn't meowing just for the sake of making noise. Instead, that cat is probably trying to communicate with other cats by meowing. Well, we know that's not true, because the passage tells us that they don't meow to talk to other cats. They use physical contact. They use their voices only to express pain. And then it says that, there's one other line here, cats with other feline companions are much quieter because they communicate in their natural way, which is not vocally, right? Not verbally. So not C. D, after all, a cat isn't meowing just for the sake of making noise. On the other hand, it is better to have more than one cat so they can better experience a natural development. That's not the main idea here. And E, after all, a cat isn't meowing just for the sake of making noise. Likely that cat is communicating love and friendship with every sound it makes. That is not necessarily true either, right? Because the passage talks about how they meow when they're in pain, or, they're trying to get any kind of message across. It doesn't necessarily say that they're trying to convey love and friendship to their human companions. It just says that that's how they communicate. So B is definitely the best answer choice here. It is the one that fits with the writer's position on the main argument of the passage. So that's how expression of ideas questions work. We have two kind of different examples here, right? One gives us the idea, the other one we have to identify the idea. You could see it in either form, but the process is very similar. It's just one extra step when we have a question like this that doesn't directly tell us what idea to express. The next question type we have are supporting idea questions. And these questions ask us to identify evidence that best supports the idea that the question asks about. So we could be supporting a main idea, we could be supporting a claim. Whatever we are supporting, we need to just choose the evidence or pick the evidence that best supports that idea. These questions, we can identify them because they will ask us to add evidence to the passage to support an idea, or they may ask us to change evidence in the passage to support an idea. But either way, we are putting evidence into the passage to support whatever idea the question asks us about. To answer these questions, we want to return to the specified area of the passage, wherever it tells us to, right? Because it's always going to tell us where to look. And identify what idea we are being asked to support. We can use our reading skills, right, to determine what the author is saying in that area of the passage that we need to support. We then, after we've identified the idea, can use process of elimination on our answer choices to determine which ones support the idea and which ones don't. And a correct answer, it's really important to keep in mind, a correct answer should be directly related to what the idea is expressing, right? The same way we use evidence in our essays that we talked about in the first couple of lessons, It's the same idea here. We want to choose the answer choice that provides the best evidence by either clarifying what the claim that we're supporting is, amplifying it, right, giving more reason why it's true, or providing an example of it. It should be direct evidence. It shouldn't just necessarily be talking about the same thing. It should be kind of supporting it, directly supporting it. The same way we want our evidence to support our claims in our writing. Same idea. Let's give it a shot here. This is a new passage that we haven't seen yet. Go ahead and skim this one, and then after you've skimmed it, give this question a try. Okay. So the question asks, the writer wants to add more information to the first paragraph to support the assertion made in sentence 2. So whatever sentence 2 says, we want to support that. All of the following pieces of evidence help to achieve this purpose except, okay, so except is important here. We have 4 good pieces of evidence. We want to identify the one bad piece of evidence. So let's read what sentence 2 says. That way we know what idea we're trying to provide evidence for, and then we can see which one works, or which one doesn't work, actually. So the idea that we're trying to support is that as President of the United States from 1977 to 1981, he, Jimmy Carter, oversaw a particularly turbulent time in American history. So good evidence would give maybe examples of how it was a turbulent time during those time periods, or, talk about, I don't know, anything related to that, right? Anything related to the United States being a turbulent time is good evidence. Bad evidence would either talk about a different time period or, there's a million examples of what bad evidence could be, but essentially we want to find the one that is not good evidence. So in order to do that, let's find the good evidence first, eliminate it, and go with whichever one is not good evidence. Let's check A. A says, a description of the Iran hostage crisis of November 1979, when 52 United States diplomats and citizens were held by militarized Iranian college students who had taken over the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. I would say that is an example of a turbulent time between 1977 and 1981, right? It's talking about terrorists and hostages and militarized college students who took over the U.S. Embassy, and it tells us that it's in 1979, which fits that time period. So I would say A is good evidence here. That supports the idea about Jimmy Carter overseeing a turbulent time in American history. B, a description of the stagflation that plagued the 1970s U.S. economy, a situation in which the inflation rate is high, economic growth slows, and unemployment is high. Turbulent, meaning like it's rough, right? This is definitely a rough thing. The economy was bad, and it's the 1970s, right, which fits in from 1977 to 1981. So B is also good evidence, which means it's not correct for this question. C, a reference to the sudden shortage of gasoline during the summer of 1979, which led to rationing, hoarding, and higher prices for consumers. Yep, also a bad thing that happened in that time period. Also good evidence. D, a description of the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan, which led Carter to impose a grain embargo against the Soviets, exacerbating the Cold War. This one doesn't give us a time period. However, it does talk about Jimmy Carter being president at that time. So I would say that is pretty good evidence, right? If Carter was president, then it must have happened during this time period. Exacerbating the Cold War is definitely not a good thing. Invasion of Afghanistan, definitely not a good thing. So definitely talking about turbulence there. We're left with E. Let's see. An enumeration of Carter's pursuit of Israeli-Egyptian peace accords, strategic arms limitation talks, and the return of the Panama Canal to Panama. It's still talking about things that happened during this time period, right? During Carter's presidency. But these are good things. They're not turbulent things. And even if you didn't know what these things are, I don't necessarily know a whole lot about these things, you can tell that they are much more peaceful based on some of the words that are used here, right? Peace accords, arms limitation, return of the Panama Canal to Panama, right? Giving the canal back to Panama, limiting arms being weapons, peace accords. These are all things that have much more of a positive connotation, as opposed to invasions of Afghanistan, exacerbating the Cold War, shortage of gasoline, rationing, higher prices, hoarding, the slow U.S. economy, high unemployment, high inflation, and militarized college students taking over a U.S. embassy, right? Those are all obviously turbulent examples, whereas D, or E rather, is not. It's better things that happened during that time period. So E would not be good evidence.